This is part 2 of the week 3 lecture on demand and supply. So we understood how a demand curve is downward sloping, and the law of demand is the higher the price, the lower the demand. The lower the price, the higher demand for the goods or services, all other things being equal, which is ceteris paribus. A supply curve is an upward sloping curve that compares price on the y-axis to quantity on the x-axis. The law of supply has price and quantity moving in the same direction. If prices go up, the quantity demanded, the producers are willing to supply at that price goes up. If the prices go down, the quantity that the suppliers or producers of the good or service they are willing to provide goes down. So price and quantity go up and down in the same direction in the supply curve and opposite directions for a demand curve. What happens when we start putting this together? Demand is constant, the supply curve changes. The supply curve is constant, and the demand curve changes. Well, there's a 4-step process that we have to work our way through this kind of discussion. We draw a demand and supply model before the economic change took place. Decide whether the economic change affects demand or supply, and it could affect both. Decide whether the effect causes a shift to the right or left in the new curve, be it supply or demand. Identify the new equilibrium and compare to the original. So here's a case where we have thousands of fish and the price per pound of fish. For some reason, here was a supply curve of fish. Maybe something happened. We had just unbelievably great weather from one year to the next, and the supply of the fish just increased dramatically. The demand for fish is the same, but the amount of fish that we had was significantly more. The equilibrium price was here. They used to sell, 350,000 fish for $3.25 a pound. But now, the supply curve shifted all the way over to here. And the new equilibrium will be $250 for the price and 550,000 fish. So there's more. It's cheaper to get, as the population of fish increased, obviously the producers are willing to sell it for less because they have an abundant amount, and the consumers win in this situation. So here it is. Supply shifted up, demand stayed the same, quantity went up, and price went down. And we're going to summarize these in class next time when we meet. So we use the 4-step method. How did excellent weather conditions during the summer affect the quantity and price of salmon? I think we just explained that. On the other hand, this is from 2004 to 2012, the share of Americans who reported obtaining their news from digital sources rather than from paper news sources or regular old TV, but more digital, like, let's talk about handheld devices and websites and such. The supply for news, so it increased. The number of people who reported obtaining their news that way increased. So what has happened? The price has come down because most of the stuff online is free. So the demand for, like, a newspaper, if this is a supply for a paper newspaper, for example, the demand for that has come down because people are getting their sources from someplace else. So what happens here was when demand shifts down, price goes down, quantity goes down. You go from equilibrium here to here. If price shifted up, both the quantity would go up and the price would go up. So when the supply chain is static and demand shifts, price and quantity go in the direction of the demand shift. Demand goes down, price goes down, quantity goes down. If we look at the previous example, where demand is static, but supply shifts, if supply shifts up, quantity goes up, but price goes down. So a shift in supply for a static demand curve, quantity goes in the direction of the shift and price goes opposite. So if we were to be here, if this was our original supply, for some reason the supply curve shifted down, quantity would go down, but price would go up. And we'll summarize that, of course, in the next class. A combined example. Using a four-step approach, what does an increase in labor compensation as well as an increase in digital communications suggest about the continued viability of the Postal Service? Okay, so people are using more email. They don't have to send so many letters. They don't have to send so many things. You can just send whatever you're going to send via email. So what happens to supply? Since there's less demand, the post office doesn't have to have, they're willing to, they're going to supply less. So the price per what they do goes up. And the demand goes down at the same time. So supply has decreased. And so we have this one, demand is fixed, but the supply decreases, which means quantity is going to go the direction of supply, but price is going to go in the opposite direction. But if we hold supply constant, and demand also decreases, will quantity and price go? How can price go up and price go down? Where do we end up with this? If we look at this curve, we start off at equilibrium 0 and end up at equilibrium 3. Definitely the quantity will decrease. Does the price go up or down? That is a question mark. If I draw it this way, it looks like the price went up a little bit. But if I shift this curve a little bit, it looks like the price, I could say where the price stays the same, or actually the price might go down. So the price change here is a question mark. When supply and demand move in the same direction, the curves shift in the same direction, the quantity sold, the quantity will move in that direction from equilibrium start to equilibrium end. So if they both go down, the quantity sold will go down. If they both go up, the quantity sold will go up. But we cannot say for certain what will happen to price. So you can see why it's important in this topic to be aware of how quantity and price influence each other. It's not always clear, and that becomes the challenge of many businesses. We will summarize this in greater detail in our next class session. And you could have multiple shifts. So just work it out the way we're talking about, where it starts at what's your first equilibrium point? What's your second equilibrium point? What's your third equilibrium point? What has happened? Can you definitively guess what's happened to quantity? It looks like it goes down, and price looks like it goes up a little bit. Now, when we talk about price controls, and I don't know if you can hear it in the background, but the vacuum cleaner is now on. So this polar vortex day, I have the phone ringing, I got the vacuum cleaner going. Governments have laws that regulate prices. They put a price ceiling in place. And a price ceiling is like rent control. It keeps the price from going up above a certain level. A price floor keeps the price from going down from a certain level. This is like minimum wage is a price floor. Rent control is price ceiling. So price ceiling keeps the price from rising above a certain level, a legal maximum price that one pays for some good or service. A price floor keeps the price from falling below a given level, is the lowest price that one can legally pay for some good or service. So let's look at a price ceiling first. The price ceiling is actually below the equilibrium point, if you see this, right? It's below the equilibrium point. And we say the price for the goods cannot go higher than this in rent control. If you let it go to equilibrium, it would rise here, but a lot of people can't afford it. So in housing in big cities where the cost of housing has gone up so dramatically, governments are sometimes have an incentive to put in a price ceiling to keep the price from going so high, so people at lower incomes can have affordable housing. What does that do? The supply curve is the same. The demand curve changes. If we move this down, if we have demand zero right here, so all of a sudden we have an equilibrium point with a given demand curve and a given supply curve. But if we're going to change this and say it's going to be, we want to have this price now, the demand curve is going to shift down to this level. And we will have what we call an excess demand, or a shortage from the price ceiling. The demand will go from, this is what we used to have, here's what we have now. So if I put a ceiling in right there, I move from this point, this is what people are willing to demand, here's what people are willing to supply, you're going to have a shortage of housing. And you get the opposite of what you actually tried to do. So when people are arguing about these things, it comes from, this might be the rational part or conservative way of looking at it, and the reasoning that many conservatives say price controls are bad. You know, having rent control or housing price controls are bad. And yet, if you think with your heart, you think, well, if someone lives in a city and works in a city and they make such a low wage but they can't afford to live in a city, that seems like a crime too, and we should do something about it. But if you do something about it, you actually create less availability according to this economic model. Let's look at the other case, where we put a price ceiling or a price floor in place. In other words, we subsidize the amount of wheat, in this case, that people could grow. But it could be minimum wage as well, where the supply is the supply of workers willing to work at that wage, and demand is the number of people that are willing to hire at that wage. Well, if we put the price artificially high above the equilibrium, the people that produce the goods, in this case wheat, are willing to produce a lot more at that price. And the people that are willing to buy it are willing to buy much less at that price. So you end up with a surplus of wheat. So when the government puts guaranteed pricing in for farmers to try to keep the farmers in business and keep them busy, you end up with a bumper inventory of goods. And that's why the government is sometimes has to deal with excess dairy stocks and wheat stocks and soybean stocks, or whatever the case may be. When it comes to minimum wage, on the other hand, let's look at this. These are the supply is the people that are looking for work at a certain wage. The demand is the number of jobs available. So if the equilibrium price is here, let's say it's $5 an hour for that demand and supply curve, and I raise it to $10 an hour, the number of people that are willing to work for that wage is higher than the number of people, the companies that are willing to hire at that wage. So you end up with less people actually working than if you just let it go to equilibrium. So that's why people, on the same token that the people who are against the price controls for housing, they're also against the establishment of minimum wage. But the hard argument also works here too. If someone is working 40 hours a week for 50 weeks a year, they should be able to earn a living wage. But if you artificially put that in, you'll actually have less jobs for that class of people. It's kind of weird. And that's why when you argue about minimum wage, we never, ever get agreement on it and don't actually have anything that ever works in that regard. All right, consumer surplus, the amount that individuals would have been willing to pay minus the amount they actually paid. The area for the market price, the area above the market price and below the demand curve. The producer surplus is the price the producer actually received minus the price the producer would have been willing to accept. the area between the market price and the segment of the supply curve below the equilibrium. Social surplus and economic surplus or total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Deadweight loss is the loss in social surplus that occurs when a market produces an inefficient quantity. That's called deadweight loss. All right, let's look at the picture and go back and forth. So here's the equilibrium point. At any price above that, the area between the demand curve and the equilibrium price line is called consumer surplus. What was that again? The amount that individuals would have been willing to pay minus the amount they actually paid. The area above the market price and below the demand curve. Above the market price, below the demand curve. So we put the price here, and we have a point here, right there. People would have been willing to pay this much for that quantity, but they're paying less. So that's a consumer surplus. So the consumer is made out. Same thing for the producer. If we sell it here, the producer was willing to sell at that quantity for a lot less. But if they get more money for it, this distance from there to there is gravy to them. We have another phone call. This time it's the daughter calling to see how the weather is.
Call from Armin.
Okay, let's see.
Call from
The
Armin.
wife answers this time.
Call from Armin.
All right. So they picked up. So consumer surplus, producer surplus. So the area F, the somewhat triangular area labeled by F, shows the area of consumer surplus, which shows the equilibrium price in the market was less than what consumers were willing to pay. Does that ever happen? Of course it does. The somewhat triangular area labeled by G shows the area of producer surplus, which shows the equilibrium price received in the market was greater than what the producers were willing to accept for their product. So they get surplus of money. If we look at efficiencies and price ceilings and floors, well, let's look at the original equilibrium price in graph A was 600, right there, with a quantity of 20,000. The consumer surplus is T plus U. Okay, so you have this amount of consumer surplus. That's the area there. The producer surplus is V plus W plus X. V plus W plus X. A price ceiling is imposed at 400. Boom. Now you have the consumer surplus is T plus V, and the producer surplus is X. If you look at a price floor, remember the floor is actually looks like a ceiling. It's above the equilibrium price, but it means the price can't go lower than this. A ceiling is actually like a floor because it's below the equilibrium point. The floor is higher than the ceiling actually, which is opposite of what we think, but it means the price can't go higher than this. This creates a shortage. This creates a surplus. So the same things apply here. The consumer surplus at equilibrium is these three, G, H, and J, and the producer surplus is I and K. If we go up to here, now the producer surplus becomes G and H, or G only, and the producer surplus is H and I. But you end up with a surplus. We'll explain all that more in our next class session. And so don't miss it. And these will be on the exam, especially what happens when supply is the same and demand shifts. What happens when demand is fixed and supply shifts, and what happens when they both shift. There will be questions on the exam for those. And it's the easiest thing to get confused about. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.